The Forest Ranger. My name is David, and I worked as a forest ranger in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State for 7 years. I thought I knew everything there was to know about those woods. Every trail, every clearing, every danger that hikers might encounter. I was wrong. There are things in those mountains that don't appear on any map. Things that have been watching from the shadows since long before the first settlers arrived. I should have paid attention to the warnings from the local Native American tribes. They'd been telling stories about the wrong paths for generations, trails that appeared and disappeared, leading hikers into places they were never meant to go. I dismissed those stories as folklore until I walked one of those paths myself. It started with a missing persons case. A family of 4, the Hendersons from Seattle, had gone hiking on the Cascade Trail 3 days earlier and never returned. Their car was still in the parking area, but there was no sign of them on any of the established trails. I'd been assigned to lead the search and rescue operation along with 2 other rangers and a team of volunteers. We'd been searching for 12 hours when I found something that shouldn't have been there. It was another trail, branching off from the main Cascade Trail, about 2 miles from the trailhead. I'd hiked that section hundreds of times over the years, and I knew for certain that no trail had ever existed there before. But there it was, a clearly defined dirt path winding up into the dense forest, marked with the same wooden trail signs as all the official park trails. The sign read Whispering Pines Loop, 3.2 miles. I radioed back to the search team. I've found an unmarked trail that might be where our missing family went. I'm going to follow it and see where it leads. Copy that, Ranger Collins. Keep in regular contact. The trail looked perfectly normal at first. Well-maintained dirt path, occasional wooden bridges over streams, mile markers every quarter mile, just like the official trails. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more something felt wrong. The trees were too quiet. In 7 years of forest work, I'd never experienced silence like this. No bird song, no rustling of small animals, no buzz of insects. Just the sound of my own footsteps on the dirt path. After about a mile, I found the first sign that the Hendersons had been this way. A child's jacket hanging from a tree branch, as if it had been deliberately placed there as a marker. I recognized it from the description their family had given us. A red windbreaker belonging to 8-year-old Emma Henderson. I found evidence of our missing family, I radioed, continuing along the trail. But when I tried to radio again 10 minutes later, I got nothing but static. I checked my GPS device and found that it showed my location as completely blank. No coordinates, no topographical markers, just an empty screen as if I didn't exist anywhere on Earth. I should have turned back then. Any reasonable person would have. But I was worried about the Henderson family, and the trail seemed to be leading somewhere specific. I could see what looked like a clearing up ahead, and I hoped I might find them there. The clearing was circular, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by trees that seemed taller and older than any I'd seen in the park before. In the center of the clearing stood a wooden structure that looked like a rustic cabin, but something about its proportions was wrong. The doors were too tall, the windows too narrow, and the roof seemed to sag in places where there was no reason for it to sag. Outside the cabin, arranged in a neat row, were 4 backpacks. I recognized them immediately from the descriptions. The Hendersons' hiking gear. "Hello," I called out. "This is Forest Ranger Collins. Are you folks okay?" No response from the cabin, but I heard something else that made my blood run cold. Whispering. Very faint, like voices having a conversation just at the edge of hearing. The sound seemed to be coming from the cabin, but also from the trees around the clearing, like an echo that arrived before the original sound. I approached the cabin carefully, my hand on the radio, even though I knew it wouldn't work. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see movement inside, shadows shifting back and forth as if people were walking around. "Henderson family, this is Forest Ranger Collins. I'm here to help you." The whispering stopped. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and what I saw defied everything I thought I knew about reality. The cabin was much larger on the inside than it appeared from outside. The ceiling stretched up at least 30 feet, disappearing into shadows that seemed too deep for any normal structure. And the room was filled with people, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still, all facing the same direction toward what looked like an altar at the far end of the room. They were wearing hiking gear from different eras, some in modern synthetic fabrics, others in wool and cotton that looked decades old. And there, standing in the front row, were the Hendersons. "Mr. Henderson," I called out, but none of them turned around. They just continued standing there, perfectly motionless, staring at the altar. I walked closer and saw that the altar was carved from a single piece of dark wood, covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly. On top of the altar sat what looked like a compass, but instead of pointing north, its needle was spinning slowly in an endless circle. "Folks, we need to get you out of here," I said, reaching out to tap Mr. Henderson on the shoulder. The moment I touched him, he turned around, and I saw his face. His eyes were completely black, like pools of oil, and his mouth was moving soundlessly as if he was speaking words I couldn't hear. The same expression was on all their faces: Mrs. Henderson, their teenage son Jake, little Emma, black eyes, moving lips, perfect silence. I stumbled backward, but more of the hikers had turned around now, all with those same black eyes, all mouthing words I couldn't understand. They began moving toward me, not walking, but gliding, their feet not quite touching the wooden floor. I ran. I burst out of the cabin and sprinted across the clearing toward where I thought the trail should be. But the opening I'd come through was gone. The clearing was completely surrounded by dense forest, with no visible path leading out. Behind me, I could hear the cabin door creaking open, and the whispering started again. But now it was louder, and I could make out individual voices. They were calling my name. "David! David Collins! Join us, David!" I picked a direction and crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. I had to find a way out of wherever I was, had to get back to the real forest and report what I'd found. But every direction I ran seemed to lead me in a circle. No matter how far I went or which way I turned, I kept ending up back at that circular clearing with its impossible cabin and its congregation of lost hikers. On my fourth attempt to escape, I noticed something that made my situation even more terrifying. The sun hadn't moved. Throughout my desperate attempts to find a way out, the light filtering through the trees had remained exactly the same. That dim, gray illumination you get in deep forest on an overcast day. Time had stopped. Or I was somewhere where time didn't work the same way. I sat down on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing and tried to think rationally about my situation. The trail that had led me here didn't exist on any official map. My radio and GPS didn't work. The cabin was bigger inside than outside, and the people inside had been changed into something that wasn't quite human anymore. I was dealing with something supernatural, something that had been luring hikers off the established trails for who knows how long. As I sat there trying to make sense of it all, I heard footsteps approaching through the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed too heavy for a normal human. A figure emerged from between the trees. A tall man, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned forest ranger uniform, the kind they might have used 50 years ago. His badge said Chief Ranger William Morrison, and his face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. but his eyes were the same oil black as the others, and his mouth was moving in that same soundless speech. "You're not supposed to be here, son," he said, and I was surprised that I could hear his voice clearly, while the others had been silent. "This place isn't for the living." "Where am I?" asked. "You're between worlds, David. This is where the lost paths lead, to a place that exists in the spaces between the real forest. The old spirits have been calling people here for generations. The Native American stories, they were true. The tribes knew to avoid certain areas, certain times of day when the barriers were thin. But your people don't listen to old warnings." Chief Ranger Morrison walked closer, and I could see that his uniform was faded and worn, like it had been weathered by decades of use. "I was the first ranger to find this place, back in 1967. Came looking for a missing Boy Scout troop, just like you came looking for that family. What happened to you?" "Same thing that's happening to you. Got lost between the worlds, became part of the place. Now I help maintain order here, help the newcomers understand their situation." "I want to leave." "Can't do that, son. Once you've seen this place, once you've breathed the air here, you're part of it. Look at your hands." I looked down and saw that my hands were becoming translucent, like I was slowly fading out of existence. The change was subtle, but undeniable. I could see the forest floor through my palms. "No, this isn't real. This is some kind of hallucination. It's as real as anything else, David. Just happening in a different layer of reality. The spirits that live here, they need servants to help them collect the lost ones. People who understand how the modern world works, who can create trails that look familiar to contemporary hikers. You're the one making the fake trails. I help, yes, along with all the others who came before. We maintain the paths, keep them looking authentic, make sure the signs match the current Park Service style." Morrison gestured toward the cabin, where more figures were emerging. I could see hikers from different decades, all wearing the gear of their respective eras, all with those same black eyes. The spirits feed on confusion, on the fear of being lost. They've been doing this since before your ancestors arrived in these mountains. We just help them adapt to changing times. "The Henderson family, can they be saved?" "They're being prepared now. Soon they'll join us in maintaining the between paths. Their fear and confusion will be absorbed by the spirits, and they'll become like us, guardians of the spaces between worlds." I could feel the change accelerating in my body. My legs were becoming transparent, and a strange calm was settling over my mind. The desperate need to escape was fading, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. "It's not so bad, son," Morrison said gently. "We're doing important work here, helping lost souls find their place, and the forest needs us." He was right. I could feel it now. The forest was alive in ways I'd never understood. It had consciousness, needs, desires, and part of those needs involved collecting the people who wandered too far from the safe paths. "What do I have to do?" I asked. "Help us create more trails. Use your knowledge of the current park system to make them convincing. Guide the lost ones to our clearing when they're ready." Morrison handed me a wooden trail marker that looked exactly like the official Park Service signs. "There's a family camping near Devil's Lake right now. The Pattersons from Portland. They're planning to hike off-trail tomorrow, looking for a more authentic wilderness experience." I took the sign, and as I did, I felt the last of my resistance drain away. This was my purpose now. This was where I belonged. Where should I place it? About a quarter-mile up the Devil's Lake Trail, just past the big fallen cedar. Make it look like it's been there for years. I spent the rest of the day, though day and night didn't seem to have much meaning in this place, learning my new duties from Morrison and the other rangers who had been collected over the decades. We had an extensive operation, Dozens of false trails throughout the mountains, all leading back to clearings like this one, where the spirits could feed on human fear and confusion. The Pattersons found my trail marker the next morning, just as Morrison had predicted. They were excited to discover a secret trail that wasn't crowded with other hikers. I watched from the shadows as they took their first steps onto the false path, their GPS devices and cell phones slowly losing signal as they walked deeper into the between world. They reached our clearing just before sunset, or what passed for sunset in our timeless realm. The ritual was always the same: initial confusion, growing fear, desperate attempts to escape, and finally acceptance as they joined our ranks. The spirits were pleased. I could feel their satisfaction like a warm glow in the back of my mind. I've been doing this work for what feels like years now, though time is hard to measure when you exist between worlds. I've helped collect dozens of hikers, families, and solo adventurers who thought they were exploring uncharted wilderness. My body has become fully translucent now, visible to the living only when I choose to be seen. I can move through the real forest without leaving tracks, can appear and disappear at will, can create trails that look like they've existed for decades. Morrison was right. It's not bad work. We're providing a service to the forest spirits, maintaining the balance between the human world and the older powers that were here first. And the people we collect aren't really dead. They're just serving a different purpose now, helping to maintain the ancient agreements between the worlds. Sometimes I see search and rescue teams looking for our missing hikers. I watch them from the shadows, remembering what it was like to be one of them. They never find any trace of the people they're looking for because those people are no longer part of the world where searches happen. If you're planning to hike in the Cascade Mountains, stick to the established trails. Don't go looking for hidden paths or secret routes. And if you find a trail that doesn't appear on your map, turn around and go back the way you came. The forest spirits are always hungry for new servants, and we're very good at our jobs. We know exactly what kind of trail markers modern hikers trust, exactly what kind of path looks inviting to people seeking adventure. We study your hiking blogs and gear reviews. We understand your desire to find places that aren't overrun with crowds, and we're always ready to give you exactly what you're looking for. A trail that no one else has ever walked, leading to places no living person has ever seen. The forest is vast and full of wonders. Some of them are meant for human eyes, others aren't. But don't worry if you accidentally find one of our trails. The fear and confusion only last a little while, and then you'll understand your new purpose. You'll join us in our work, helping to maintain the balance between the worlds. The spirits need servants who understand the modern world, who can adapt their ancient methods to contemporary sensibilities. And there's always room for one more ranger in the between paths. Just follow the signs. We'll take care of the rest. House sitting. My name is Mike, and I'm 22 years old. I was a college student trying to make some extra cash during winter break when my professor offered me a house-sitting job. Dr. Hartwell needed someone to watch his place while he and his wife went to Europe for 3 weeks. The pay was good, $500 just to live in a beautiful house, water the plants, and collect the mail. The house was in Westchester County, about an hour north of the city. It was one of those sprawling ranch houses from the 1960s, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows, set back on 5 acres of wooded property. Dr. Hartwell gave me the tour the day before he left. The thermostat can be tricky, he said, adjusting it in the hallway. Sometimes it doesn't register properly, so if you get cold, just give it a tap. The hot water heater is in the basement. There's a flashlight in the kitchen drawer if you need to check on anything down there. Mrs. Hartwell showed me where they kept the good coffee and gave me a list of which plants needed water and when. The neighbors are about a quarter-mile away on either side, she said, but don't hesitate to call them if you need anything. We've left their numbers on the refrigerator. They left that evening, and suddenly I had this gorgeous house all to myself. I spent the first night exploring, checking out Dr. Hartwell's impressive book collection, and raiding their well-stocked kitchen. I set up my laptop in the living room, planning to get some work done on my senior thesis while I was there. The first few days were perfect. I fell into a routine: wake up late, make coffee, work on my thesis, order takeout, watch Netflix on their huge TV. The house was incredibly quiet, surrounded by woods with no traffic noise or city sounds. Just the occasional creak of the house settling and the wind in the trees outside. It was on the fourth night that I first noticed something was off. I was working late, probably around 1 a.m., when I heard what sounded like a car door slamming outside. I looked out the front window, but didn't see any headlights or vehicles in the driveway. The motion sensor lights that lit up the front walkway hadn't come on either. I figured it might have been a neighbor coming home late, or maybe just a branch falling in the woods. But about 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. These weren't animal sounds. They were definitely human footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the loose stones that lined the drive. I turned off the lights in the living room and peered out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the reach of the porch light. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock or a doorbell, but nothing happened. After about 5 minutes of silence, I turned the lights back on and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just deer. They were common in the area, and their hoof steps might sound like footsteps on gravel. But I double-checked all the locks before going to bed that night. The next day, I mentioned it to my girlfriend when she called. "You're just not used to being alone in a big house," she said. "Every sound gets amplified when you're by yourself." She was probably right. But that night I kept the curtains closed and the TV volume low, listening for any sounds from outside. Everything seemed normal until around midnight, when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop at the front door. They moved around the side of the house, slowly and purposefully, like someone was checking the windows. I grabbed a baseball bat I'd found in the closet and followed the sound as best I could from inside, tracking the footsteps as they moved along the exterior wall. The steps went all the way around the house and then stopped at the sliding glass door that led to the back patio. I crept to the kitchen window and carefully lifted one slat of the blinds. The backyard was dark, but the motion sensor light over the patio should have turned on if anyone was out there. It hadn't. I waited there for almost an hour, bat in hand, but I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps leaving, no car starting up, nothing. It was like whoever was out there had just vanished. The next morning, I walked around the outside of the house, looking for any signs that someone had been there. I found footprints in the soft earth under the living room window. Definitely human, made by boots with a distinctive tread pattern. They led from the driveway around the house and stopped at the back patio. But here's the weird part. There were no footprints leading away. I called the local police and filed a report. Officer Martinez came out and looked at the prints, took some photos, and walked the perimeter with me. "Could be someone just curious about the house," he said. "Sometimes when a place looks empty, people get ideas. But the fact that there's no trail leading away is strange. Maybe they walked backward in their own prints?" He suggested I call if it happened again and gave me his direct number. That night, I was ready. I had the baseball bat, my phone with 911 pre-dialed, and I'd positioned myself in the kitchen where I could see both the front and back of the house. I had also called my buddy Jake and asked him to stay on the line with me, just in case. "Dude, you're paranoid," Jake said over the phone. "It's probably just some homeless guy looking for a place to crash." "Then why didn't the motion sensors go off?" I asked. "Maybe they're broken. Maybe he's staying low. There's a rational explanation." But at 12:47 a.m., the footsteps came again. This time, Jake could hear them through the phone. "Holy shit, Mike," he whispered. "What is that?" The steps were slower tonight, more deliberate, and there were more of them. It sounded like at least 2 people, maybe 3, moving around the house in formation. I tracked their movement from window to window, but every time I tried to get a glimpse outside, I saw nothing but empty darkness. "Call the cops," Jake said. "Right now." I dialed Officer Martinez's number while the footsteps continued their circuit around the house. But when he answered, I could barely speak, because the footsteps had stopped directly outside the kitchen window, where I was standing, and I could hear breathing. Heavy, raspy breathing, like someone who'd been running. But the footsteps had been moving slowly, calmly. There was no reason for anyone to be out of breath. "Hello, Mike? Are you there?" Officer Martinez was saying. "They're right outside," I whispered. "Right outside the window." "Stay on the line, I'm on my way." The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then suddenly, it stopped. I heard the footsteps moving away from the house, back toward the driveway. But instead of the sound fading into the distance, it just stopped abruptly, like someone had turned off a recording. Officer Martinez arrived 15 minutes later with backup. They searched the property with flashlights, checked the woods around the house, even brought in a dog to track any scent trails. They found nothing. "The footprints from yesterday are still here," Martinez said, shining his light under the living room window. "But there are no fresh ones. Ground soft enough that we should see new prints if someone was walking around tonight." I showed him the exact spots where I'd heard the footsteps, but there was no evidence anyone had been there. "Mike," he said finally, "is there any chance you might be dealing with some stress? Sometimes when we're alone in unfamiliar places, our minds can play tricks on us." I wanted to argue, but what could I say? Even Jake, who'd heard it over the phone, was starting to doubt what he'd experienced. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, baseball bat across my lap, jumping at every sound. But the house was completely silent. The next day, I decided to do some research. I drove to the local library and looked up the history of Dr. Hartwell's property. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1978, a family of 4 had been murdered in a house that used to stand on the same lot. The killer was never found, but witnesses reported seeing multiple figures moving around the property on the night of the murders. The original house had been torn down, and Dr. Hartwell's place was built on the foundation 5 years later. The newspaper article included a detail that made my hands shake as I read it. Police found footprints circling the house, but were unable to determine how the perpetrators left the scene, as the tracks simply ended at the back patio. I packed my things that afternoon and called Dr. Hartwell in London, telling him I had a family emergency and couldn't continue house-sitting. He was understanding, even offered to let me keep half the money. I spent the remaining 2 weeks of winter break at my parents' house, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, about the breathing outside the window, about footprints that appeared but never led away. Dr. Hartwell called me when he got back from Europe. "Strangest thing," he said. "We came home to find footprints all around the house. The police think it might have been kids messing around while the place was empty." I didn't tell him that I'd heard those same footsteps every night I was there, after the police had already documented the prints. I didn't tell him that whatever was walking around his house wasn't making new prints, because it wasn't entirely there to make them. Some houses hold on to their history, and Dr. Hartwell's house was still reliving the worst night it had ever seen. Every night those murderers came back, circling their prey, planning their attack on a family that was no longer there. I've never house sat again, and I've never told anyone the whole truth about what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps outside my window, and I know they're not done with me yet. The Museum Night Watchman. My name is Thomas, and I worked as a night security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Natural History in New York City for 2 years. It's one of the most prestigious museums in the world, housing millions of artifacts from every corner of human history. During the day, it's filled with tourists, school groups, and researchers. But at night, when the lights dim and the crowds disappear, the museum becomes something entirely different. The museum is massive, 4 city blocks, 5 stories, and over 2 million square feet of exhibition space. My job was to patrol the halls from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., making sure the climate control systems were working, checking for intruders, and ensuring that none of the priceless artifacts were disturbed. It should have been a quiet, routine job. Museums don't usually have problems with break-ins. Who's going to steal a dinosaur skeleton or a meteorite? Most nights, the only sounds were my footsteps echoing through the empty halls and the hum of the environmental systems, keeping the artifacts at perfect temperature and humidity. But from my very first night, I knew something was different about this place. My supervisor, Frank Rodriguez, had worked museum security for 15 years. He was the one who trained me, showing me the patrol routes and explaining the security protocols. The Met's got personality, he told me, as we walked through the darkened Egyptian wing. Lots of history in one place, you know? Sometimes you might hear things. Footsteps, voices, doors closing. Don't worry about it. Old buildings make noise, especially when they're filled with artifacts from ancient civilizations. He paused in front of a glass case containing Egyptian canopic jars. Just remember, everything in here used to belong to someone. Some of these artifacts are thousands of years old, and they've got their own stories. Respect them, and they'll respect you. I thought he was just giving me the standard orientation speech about treating the collection with reverence. I didn't understand that he was giving me a literal warning. My first few nights were uneventful. I walked my routes, checked the doors and windows, and filed my reports. The museum was beautiful in the darkness, moonlight streaming through the tall windows, casting dramatic shadows on the exhibits. It felt like being alone in a cathedral dedicated to human knowledge and achievement. The first strange incident happened during my 4th night on the job. I was walking through the Hall of African Peoples around 1 a.m. when I heard music. It was faint, barely audible, but it sounded like drums and some kind of stringed instrument. Traditional African music, the kind that might have been played centuries ago around a village fire. I followed the sound to its source, a display case containing artifacts from a 14th century West African kingdom. Masks, jewelry, musical instruments, and ceremonial objects that had been donated to the museum in the 1960s. The music seemed to be coming from inside the display case, but when I got close enough to investigate, it stopped. I made a note in my report about possible audio equipment malfunction. Sometimes, the educational displays had sound components that could glitch, but when I checked with the day staff, they confirmed that none of the African exhibits had any electronic components. The next night, I heard the music again, but this time it was accompanied by other sounds. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, and what sounded like people moving around, as if there was a gathering happening somewhere in the darkened museum. I tried to track down the source of the sounds, but they always seemed to be coming from just around the corner, just out of sight. Every time I thought I was getting close, the sounds would fade away. On my sixth night, I encountered something that couldn't be explained away as audio equipment or old building noises. I was walking through the ancient Egypt hall when I saw someone moving among the sarcophagi, a figure in white robes gliding silently between the glass cases. At first, I thought it might be a late working researcher or conservator, but when I called out, the figure didn't respond. I followed the figure deeper into the Egyptian wing, but when I turned the corner where I'd seen them go, the hallway was empty. There was nowhere they could have gone. No doors, no side passages, just a dead-end wall lined with hieroglyphic inscriptions. But the air in that hallway was different, warmer than the rest of the museum, and filled with a scent I couldn't identify. Something like incense and spices and something else, something organic and old. I spent an extra hour checking that section of the museum, looking for any sign of an intruder, but I found nothing. All the doors were locked, all the windows were secure, and the security cameras showed only my own movements through the halls. The next day, I mentioned the incident to Frank, but he just nodded like it was nothing unusual. "You saw one of the Egyptians," he said matter-of-factly. "They're the most active spirits in the museum, probably because we have so many of their burial goods and personal possessions." "Spirits?" Frank looked at me like I was naive. "Thomas, this museum houses artifacts from every culture on Earth, going back thousands of years. Many of these objects were sacred, or they belonged to people who died violently, or they were stolen from graves and temples. You think all that history doesn't leave an impression? You're saying the museum is haunted. I'm saying the museum is home to more than just artifacts. The spirits of the people who owned these objects, who created them, who died protecting them. Some of them followed their possessions here. They're not malicious mostly. They just want to be near the things that were important to them in life. This wasn't covered in the employee handbook. Does management know about this?" Frank laughed. "Kid, management has known about this for decades. Why do you think we do security patrols instead of just relying on alarms and cameras? We're not just protecting the artifacts from thieves. We're keeping an eye on the spiritual residents, making sure they don't get too restless." "How many guards know about this?" "All the night shift guys. You can't work here long without encountering them. Most people quit after a few weeks. Those who stay learn to coexist with the spirits." That night, I approached my patrol with a completely different mindset. Instead of just checking for intruders and mechanical problems, I was looking for signs of supernatural activity. I didn't have to look hard. The Egyptian wing was definitely the most active area. I saw the figure in white robes again, and this time I didn't try to chase them. Instead, I watched from a distance as they moved through the hall, stopping at certain displays and standing motionless for several minutes at a time. They were visiting specific artifacts: a golden burial mask, a set of canopic jars, a wooden statue of a pharaoh, objects that had probably belonged to them in life, thousands of years ago. When they noticed me watching, they didn't run or disappear. Instead, they turned toward me and raised one hand in what looked like a greeting. I raised my hand in return, and the spirit seemed satisfied. They continued their rounds for another hour, then faded away as the first hint of dawnlight appeared in the windows. The Native American Hall had its own spiritual residence. I would often hear the sound of drums and chanting coming from the displays of ceremonial objects. Sometimes I would see figures in traditional dress performing what looked like ritual dances around cases containing sacred artifacts. The medieval European section was haunted by what appeared to be knights and nobles, still guarding treasures and weapons that had been looted from their tombs centuries ago. I once saw a translucent figure in armor standing vigil over a display of medieval swords, as if protecting them from thieves. But the most unsettling area was the Hall of Human Origins, where the museum kept its collection of early human fossils and prehistoric artifacts. The spirits there were older, more primitive, and much less comprehensible than the ghosts in other parts of the museum. I would hear sounds that seemed to come from the dawn of human consciousness, guttural vocalizations, the scraping of stone tools, footsteps that didn't sound quite human. One night, I saw a figure crouched over the display case containing Lucy, the famous early human fossil. The figure was small, ape-like, but unmistakably intelligent. It was touching the glass with what looked like reverence, as if greeting an old friend. When it noticed me watching, it looked up with eyes that held a deep, ancient sadness. Then it spoke, in a voice that seemed to come from the very beginnings of language. "Home, sheep, home." I realized I was looking at the spirit of one of Lucy's people, someone who had lived and died 3 million years ago, somehow following the remains of their companion across time and space to this museum in New York. The encounter left me shaken in ways I couldn't explain. I was looking at the ghost of someone who had lived before civilization, before agriculture, before written language. Yet there was something fundamentally human in those ancient eyes, something that connected us across millions of years of evolution. As the weeks passed, I began to understand the complex ecosystem of spirits that inhabited the museum. They weren't random hauntings. They were purposeful presences, connected to specific artifacts and exhibits. The Egyptian spirits were the most organized, maintaining what appeared to be a complex social hierarchy, even in death. The pharaohs and nobles stayed in the main Egyptian hall, while the common people gathered around displays of everyday objects from their era. The Native American spirits were more territorial, each tribe's ghosts staying close to their own cultural artifacts. They seemed to be performing ongoing ceremonies and rituals, as if death hadn't interrupted their spiritual practices. The European medieval spirits acted like eternal guards, protecting weapons and treasures that had been buried with them. They took their duties seriously, and I learned to nod respectfully when I encountered them during my rounds. But it was the prehistoric spirits that fascinated me the most. They represented the very roots of human consciousness, the first people to create tools, to bury their dead, to wonder about the world beyond their immediate experience. I started spending extra time in the Hall of Human Origins, trying to communicate with these ancient presences. Most of them were too primitive for complex communication, but there were a few, spirits from more recent prehistoric periods, who could understand basic concepts. One of them, who seemed to be associated with a Neanderthal skull from about 40,000 years ago, began appearing to me regularly. He was stocky and powerful looking, with the distinctive brow ridge and robust features of his species. He couldn't speak modern language, but he was intelligent and curious. He would point to the various fossils and artifacts, then look at me questioningly, as if trying to understand how his people's remains had ended up in this strange place. I started bringing a tablet computer with pictures of archaeological sites, showing him where the fossils had been discovered. He seemed to recognize some of the locations, nodding with excitement when I showed him pictures of European caves where Neanderthal remains had been found. Through gestures and simple drawings, he communicated that he had been a toolmaker in life, someone respected in his community for his skill with stone and bone. He was proud of the Neanderthal tool displays in the museum, touching the glass cases with obvious recognition and satisfaction. But he was also lonely. His people were extinct, and he was the only spirit of his kind in the museum. The other prehistoric ghosts were either too ancient to communicate with, or belonged to different species entirely. I began to feel sorry for him, this last representative of a vanished branch of humanity, forever separated from his own kind by death and the passage of tens of thousands of years. One night, about 6 months into my job, something changed in the museum's spiritual ecosystem. New artifacts had arrived, a collection of recently discovered Neanderthal remains from a cave site in France. The fossils were being prepared for a special exhibition on human evolution. When my Neanderthal friend first saw the new displays being set up, his reaction was immediate and emotional. He rushed to the cases, pressing his translucent hands against the glass, and began making sounds of joy and recognition. These weren't just any Neanderthal remains. They were his family. Over the next few nights, I watched as other Neanderthal spirits began appearing in the museum. First one, then two, then a whole group of them, all drawn by the presence of their remains and the spirit of their kinsman who had been waiting alone for so long. They gathered around the new displays like a family reunion, communicating in their ancient language and performing what looked like ceremony and celebration. For the first time since I'd known him, my Neanderthal friend looked truly happy, but their joy was short-lived. The museum administration had decided to move the Neanderthal collection to a different location, the Museum of Natural History in London, where it would be part of a major international exhibition on human evolution. When the crates were loaded onto trucks and driven away, taking the fossils to the airport, the Neanderthal spirits went with them. All of them, including my friend. I never saw him again. The Hall of Human Origins felt empty after that, despite being filled with other prehistoric remains. The specific presence that had made it special was gone, following his people's bones across the ocean to their new home. That's when I began to understand the true nature of my job. I wasn't just a security guard. I was a caretaker for the spirits who had followed their possessions into the museum. When artifacts were moved, loaned to other institutions, or returned to their countries of origin, their spiritual guardians went with them. The museum was in constant flux, not just in terms of its physical collection, but in terms of its ghostly population. Spirits came and went as their associated artifacts moved through the museum's acquisition, exhibition, and loan programs. Some nights, entire sections of the museum would feel empty and lifeless because major pieces had been loaned to other institutions. Other nights, new spirits would appear along with recently acquired artifacts, adding their presence to the museum's supernatural community. I began to keep detailed notes on the spiritual activity, tracking which exhibits were most active and how the ghost population changed over time. It became a kind of paranormal anthropology, studying the afterlife culture of people from dozens of different civilizations. My notes caught the attention of Dr. Margaret Chen, a cultural anthropologist who worked as a curator in the museum's African and Pacific collections. She had been studying the intersection of spirituality and material culture for years, and she was fascinated by my observations. What you're describing matches traditional beliefs from many cultures, she told me during one of our conversations. The idea that objects carry spiritual essence, that the dead maintain connections to their possessions, these are universal human concepts. So you believe what I'm seeing is real? I think you're witnessing something that most of human civilization has taken for granted, that the boundary between the living and the dead is much more porous than modern Western culture admits. Dr. Chen began accompanying me on some of my night rounds, documenting the spiritual activity with scientific rigor. She was particularly interested in how the behavior of different cultural groups' spirits reflected their traditional beliefs about death and the afterlife. The Egyptian spirits maintained their social hierarchy because that's how they believed the afterlife would work, she explained. The Native American spirits continue performing ceremonies because their cultures taught that spiritual practices don't end with death. Each group is behaving exactly as their beliefs would predict. But our research was interrupted when the museum underwent a major renovation. Entire wings were closed, artifacts were moved to storage, and construction crews worked around the clock to update the building's infrastructure. The spiritual disruption was immediate and dramatic. Spirits who had been peacefully coexisting with the living suddenly became agitated and unpredictable. Doors slammed shut on their own. Exhibits were mysteriously rearranged overnight, and several construction workers reported seeing figures in period dress watching them work. The situation came to a head when a priceless Egyptian sarcophagus was accidentally damaged during the move to temporary storage. The spirit associated with that sarcophagus, a high priest from the 18th dynasty, was furious. For 3 nights, the museum was plagued by what could only be described as a supernatural tantrum. Lights flickered, temperature controls malfunctioned, and several security cameras captured footage of objects moving by themselves. I was called in to try to calm the situation, to communicate with the angry spirit and find out what would appease him. It took hours of patient negotiation, but eventually I understood what he wanted. The damage to his sarcophagus had been minor, a small chip in the decorative border, but from his perspective, his eternal resting place had been desecrated. He wanted acknowledgement of the damage, a formal apology, and assurance that his sarcophagus would be properly restored. I conveyed his demands to the museum administration, who were initially skeptical, but became believers when the supernatural disturbances continued to escalate. Finally, the museum director himself came in after hours to formally apologize to the spirit and promise that the sarcophagus would be restored by the best conservators available. The disturbances stopped immediately. Word of the incident spread through the museum community, and I began receiving calls from other institutions experiencing similar problems. Museums around the world were dealing with spiritual unrest as their collections were moved, renovated, or repatriated. I became an unofficial consultant on museum hauntings, helping institutions understand and communicate with the spirits attached to their artifacts. It was strange work, but it was important. These spirits were part of humanity's cultural heritage, just as much as the objects they protected. After 2 years at the Met, I was offered a position as Director of Supernatural Relations at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. It was a newly created position, acknowledgement that major museums needed specialists who could deal with the spiritual aspects of their collections. I accepted the job, but I missed my time at the Met. There was something special about walking those halls at night, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and beauty of human civilization, sharing the space with the spirits of people who had created and treasured these objects thousands of years ago. The museum is still there, still housing its incredible collection, still providing a home for the spirits who refuse to be separated from their earthly possessions. New night guards patrol the halls, learning to coexist with the ghostly residents, carrying on a tradition that's probably as old as the first museum. If you ever visit the Metropolitan Museum of Natural History, pay attention to the shadows between the display cases. Notice how some exhibits seem to have a presence beyond their physical artifacts. Listen for the whispers of ancient languages, the echoes of long-dead civilizations still clinging to the objects that once defined their lives. The museum's website doesn't mention its supernatural residents, and the tour guides won't tell you about the spirits that walk the halls after closing time. But they're there, just as they've always been, maintaining their eternal vigil over the treasures of human history. I still work with museums around the world, helping them understand and accommodate their ghostly populations. It's become a recognized field, paranormal museum studies, and more institutions are acknowledging what their night staff have always known, that some collections come with spiritual attachments that can't be cataloged or stored away. The work is challenging and sometimes dangerous. Not all museum spirits are as benevolent as the ones I encountered at the Met. Some are angry about having their possessions stolen from graves or sacred sites. Others are confused and frightened, not understanding how they ended up in a foreign country surrounded by artifacts from cultures they don't recognize. But most of them just want to be acknowledged, to have their connection to their earthly possessions respected. They're not trying to scare anyone. They're just people who refuse to let death separate them from the things they loved most in life. At the Smithsonian, I work with a team of anthropologists, historians, and paranormal researchers to develop protocols for dealing with spiritual manifestations in museum settings. We've created guidelines for communicating with artifact-bound spirits, procedures for managing supernatural disturbances, and training programs for security staff who encounter ghostly residents. We've also established a network of museums that share information about spiritual activity, tracking how spirits move with traveling exhibitions, and helping institutions prepare for potential supernatural visitors. The work has led to some remarkable discoveries. Spirits often provide information about their artifacts that isn't available in any historical record. They can explain the true purpose of mysterious objects, provide details about how items were made or used, and correct misattributions that have persisted for decades. One Egyptian spirit helped us realize that a sarcophagus we dated to the New Kingdom actually belonged to an earlier dynasty. A Roman ghost provided the correct pronunciation of Latin inscriptions that scholars had been debating for years. A Native American spirit explained the ceremonial significance of objects that had been labeled simply as decorative items. These collaborations between the living and the dead have revolutionized our understanding of cultural artifacts. Museums are starting to acknowledge spirits not as unwanted hauntings, but as valuable consultants who can provide first-hand knowledge about their collections. But there are ethical considerations too. Is it right to keep artifacts in museums if doing so traps the spirits of their original owners? Should we return all grave goods and sacred objects to their places of origin, even if it means losing valuable research opportunities? These are questions that the museum community is still grappling with. Some institutions have begun repatriation programs specifically designed to free trapped spirits, returning artifacts to their homelands so that the associated ghosts can find peace. Others argue that museums serve as sanctuaries for spirits whose original burial sites have been destroyed or developed. The museum becomes a kind of spiritual preserve, protecting both artifacts and their ghostly guardians from a modern world that has little room for either. I lean toward the sanctuary perspective. Having worked with hundreds of museum spirits over the years, I have seen that most of them are content to remain with their possessions, regardless of location. They adapt to their new environments, learning to coexist with museum staff, and even helping to protect their artifacts from damage or theft. The key is treating them with respect, acknowledging their presence, and understanding that they have a legitimate claim to the objects they've followed across time and space. My current project involves establishing the first formal communication protocols between museum spirits and living researchers. We're developing a kind of paranormal interview process, allowing ghosts to share their knowledge about artifacts while ensuring that the process doesn't traumatize either the spirits or the researchers. It's delicate work. Some spirits are eager to communicate, desperate to share their stories after decades or centuries of being ignored. Others are suspicious of the living, having been disturbed too many times by well-meaning but insensitive researchers. But when it works, the results are extraordinary. We've learned more about daily life in ancient civilizations from conversations with spirits than from decades of traditional archaeological research. A Mayan priest explained the astronomical calculations behind their calendar system. A medieval craftsman demonstrated techniques for creating stained glass that had been lost for centuries. A Chinese scholar provided translations of texts that had been considered undecipherable. These collaborations are changing how we think about death, memory, and the preservation of human knowledge. The spirits in our museums aren't just echoes of the past. They're active participants in ongoing cultural exchange between the living and the dead. But the work takes its toll. Spending so much time communicating with spirits, mediating between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I see ghosts everywhere now, not just in museums, but in old buildings, cemeteries, antique shops, anywhere that objects carry strong emotional or spiritual attachments. The boundary between the living and dead world has become so thin for me that sometimes I'm not sure which side I belong to. My apartment is filled with artifacts I've acquired over the years, objects that came with their own spiritual residence. I share my living space with the ghosts of a Victorian clockmaker, a Depression-era jazz musician, and a World War II nurse, among others. We've developed a kind of strange household dynamic. They help me with my research, providing insights into their respective time periods, and I provide them with a comfortable place to exist and someone who acknowledges their presence. But I worry sometimes that I'm becoming too comfortable in the world of the dead, that I'm losing my connections to the living world. My colleagues have expressed concern about my increasing isolation from normal human relationships. They're probably right. It's easier to talk to spirits than to living people. The dead don't judge you, don't make demands, don't leave you for better opportunities. They're grateful just to be heard, to have someone acknowledge their existence. But they also can't provide the warmth and connection that comes from relationships with the living. They can share their knowledge and their stories, but they can't truly participate in the world of growth and change that defines life. I'm caught between two worlds now, serving as a bridge between the living and the dead, but not fully belonging to either. It's the occupational hazard of my work. The more you communicate with spirits, the more you start to resemble them. Sometimes, I wonder if this is how it ends for people in my line of work. Do we eventually become so immersed in the world of the dead that we lose our grip on life itself? Will I end up as just another museum ghost, forever wandering the halls and sharing stories with whoever is willing to listen? But then, I remember the importance of what I do. Someone has to speak for the spirits, to ensure that their voices are heard and their rights are respected. Someone has to maintain the communication channels between the worlds of the living and the dead. The museum spirits aren't just remnants of the past. They're guardians of human memory, preserving knowledge and culture that would otherwise be lost forever. They deserve our respect and attention, not just our fear. And if serving as their advocate means existing somewhere between life and death, then perhaps that's a price worth paying. After all, we're all heading toward that realm eventually. Maybe learning to communicate with its residents now will help me when it's my turn to cross over. The museums of the world will always need guardians, both living and dead. The artifacts in their collections represent the best of human achievement, and they deserve protectors who understand their true value. I'll continue my work as long as I can, helping museums and spirits coexist, facilitating communication between past and present, ensuring that the voices of the dead aren't forgotten by the living. Because in the end, we're all just temporary custodians of human culture. The spirits in our museums understand this better than most. They've already made the transition from temporary to eternal, and they're still here, still protecting the things they loved, still sharing their knowledge with anyone wise enough to listen. The next time you visit a museum, remember that you're not just looking at artifacts. You're entering a community where past and present coexist, where the dead continue their work as teachers and guardians, where every object has a story that extends far beyond its physical existence. Listen carefully, and you might hear them whispering their secrets. Pay attention, and you might see them watching from the shadows. Respect them, and they might just share their wisdom with you. The museum never truly closes. It just shifts from the living to the dead. And the night watchmen, both corporeal and spiritual, continue their eternal rounds.